So we began this semester talking about some of the goals of consumers. Resources are scarce, we said. So consumers and producers, but consumers for this chapter, want to try and maximize their profit given their resources, given a budget constraint. So now we're going to start looking at how consumers make choices. Now, this is going to be one of those ones you might recall from chapter 1 where we discussed economics as a model, not a literal description. So some of what we're about to talk about, you're going to be like, well, I don't make a choice like that. I don't make decisions. That's true. You don't. Rather, we're saying people act as if this is what they do. And one thing that we find empirically is this is a pretty useful way of studying people's behavior. So without further ado, again, we assume that people are constrained by a budget. They only have so much income, and we're going to apply it towards a choice of, in this case, 2 goods. We can make it more. We can have an infinite number of goods, but the math gets confusing. We don't need to worry about that. And we're going to assume that people want to maximize their total utility or the satisfaction derived from their choices. Now, this is one of our first kind of objectionable points. I'm just going to say economists claim that we can measure utility. Of course we can't. You cannot tell me in numbers in a way that I can understand how much you love your family or your pets. But economists say, yeah, we can figure that out. It's just a silly modeling assumption that we use to help explain why people do what they do. So we're assuming that people want to maximize their total utility. You might also recall that we discussed marginal utility or marginal returns, same sort of idea. A marginal utility is the additional utility provided by one additional unit of consumption of that good. T-shirts and movies, for example. So the marginal utility is a change in total utility divided by the change in quantity. That's all it is. And we see a general pattern of diminishing marginal utility. As we consume more goods, we get less pleasure, yet less utility than the previous unit. So let's put a little bit this into practice. Let's say that we have Jose here. He has an income of $56, and he's trying to decide between movies and T-shirts. The budget constraint shows the combinations of movies and T-shirts that are affordable. I realize I don't think I was sharing my screen this time throughout this point. Well, you're seeing it now. So yeah, budget constraints, total utility, just definitions. The marginal utility is the change in total utility over the change in quantity. Sorry about that. So choice in consumption goods. Jose has an income of $56. He has movies cost $7, T-shirts cost $14. So if he were to spend his entire income on movies, he would be able to get 8 movies and no T-shirts. If he spent it all on T-shirts, 4 T-shirts and no movies, or some combination thereof. Now we want to know, what is the point? What is the combination of T-shirts and movies that's going to make Jose the best off? How can he maximize his total utility? Your gut reaction might be to say, well, why doesn't he just figure out whichever brings him the most utility, movies or T-shirts, and just put everything in that? Well, that's a good thought, but it's wrong. We only have so many dollars, 56. So we want to try and get the most out of each dollar. So what we're going to look at is the marginal utility per price of each good. So we're going to take the marginal utility of a certain good and divide it by its price. By definition, the point where total utility is maximized is where the marginal utility divided by the price of good 1 is equal to the marginal utility divided by the price of good 2. What this is saying is the extra dollar that you spend on good 1 brings you just as much utility as the extra dollar you spend on good 2. If this ratio is not equal, if say the marginal utility of good 1 divided by the price is higher than the marginal utility of good 2, then you'll want to consume more of good 1 and less of good 2 to bring it into equality. That is the utility maximizing point. That's a mathematical factor. That's a mathematical point. So incomes, prices, preferences, all these affect consumption choices. Again, we're assuming that these are goods. So as your income increases, so what goods means is you prefer more to less, but also that you're faced with budgets. So the neat thing is utility and marginal utility can be used to analyze how consumer choices change when budget constraints shift in response to changes in income or price. So let's say that we have an example, concert tickets versus getaways. Different leisure items. Let's also pretend that this is not a plague year and that you can either do an overnight getaway or go out to a concert. We're just going to assume that originally the maximizing point is this point M here. 3 overnight stays, 8 concert tickets. Well, an increase in your income will shift the budget constraint outward to this new line here. So what this then means is, depending on your utility function, which we're not talking about, or which I haven't given you, we can analyze whether or not concert tickets and overnight getaways are a normal good. In other words, as your income increases, you consume more of it. An inferior good, which is something which as your income increases, you consume less of it. Note that a inferior good is a decrease in demand, not decrease in quantity demand. It is not a violation of the law of demand. So if your income increases and the new utility maximizing point based on the ratio we talked about a couple minutes ago is, say, point N here, then both goods are normal goods. Our income increases, so we consume more of both. If instead the new maximizing point is this point P here, then concert tickets are a normal good, overnight stays are an inferior good. And the opposite is true with point Q here. So if your income changes, your entire budget curve gets shifted out. If only price changes, however, only the budget constraint doesn't get shifted out, it rotates. So in this particular example, our initial budget constraint goes through point M here. If the price of baseball bats rise relative to cameras, then the budget constraint moves inward like this. And we can see whether or not we're consuming more or less of baseball bats, cameras, etc., based on the new budget constraint and the new utility maximizing point. So what we've seen here, what we talked a little bit about is the response to higher prices is that people consume less of the product with the higher price. That's the quantity, the law of demand. However, why people consume less are based on two things: the substitution effect and the income effect. The substitution effect suggests that as prices rise, people search out substitutes. The income effect suggests that as prices rise, people's buying power has been reduced. These two are not, it's not a one or the other thing. They tend to happen in demand, excuse me, they tend to happen at the same time. And we can analyze whether a change in quantity demand is mostly by substitution effect or mostly by income effect based on marginal utilities and things like that. So what all this adds up to is the demand curve. You will not have to calculate these in class, but rather I want you to see the basic idea that as price of, in this case, housing increases, our quantity demanded of housing falls. We start at M0, go to M1, M2, M3. But all this adds up to is eventually a demand curve. We can derive the demand curve from watching how people react to changes in prices. Of course, it's way more complicated than this in real life. But the basic takeaway here is we assume that people want to maximize their total utility. So they want to maximize the total utility they can get per dollar. And the point where amongst the choices, the utility per dollar that they can get is on the margin is equal between two goods. That's their utility maximizing point. Now, utility is, of course, broadly defined as satisfaction. So that can mean anything. It doesn't have to mean material satisfaction. We don't have to assume people are materialists. Just whatever brings them pleasure. Leisure is pleasure, and leisure costs money. And I'm not just talking about the cost of a vacation. If I want more leisure time, I don't have to teach this class, but the cost is the lost income that I get. So it's a choice that I can make. And we're assuming that people choose at the point where, on the margin, their marginal utility per dollar of one good is equal to the marginal utility of another good. So that's the basic idea behind consumer choice and the demand curve. We're next going to talk about the supply curve.